Hi, everyone, and welcome to Cyber Risk Engineering. We're here with my fellow friend, Tom Brennan, and we're going to be discussing what Crest are doing with OVS, the OWASP verification standard. Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Jonas. I really appreciate the invite to talk a little bit about this.
Perfect. So, Tom, just tell us a little bit about you before we dive into the details of what Crest is doing with OVS. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I'm currently the executive director part-time
Mhm.
for Crest, running the Americas. I have some counterparts in the UK and also in Australia, but in the United States, I'm very focused on national critical infrastructure.
Mhm.
And before that, I was also focused on national critical infrastructure, but I was very much involved in the Open Web Application Security Project, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But with OWASP, not only did I run the New York City chapter with the help of a lot of volunteers, but I also served on the board of directors for OWASP for about 10 years. So I had a chance to sort of see the organization with a few hundred people
Mhm.
and then bring it to thousands of people with all over the world.
And I think some of the things that you guys tried out in the OWASP New York, New Jersey, and NYC Metro chapter really then resonated at a global level. So it was an honor to have you involved between that sort of 10, 11, 12-year period and having worked with you back then when application security was just slightly more immature, let's say, like you could put a tick character in a website and get a SQL injection error back. Of course, all under authority, right? Do you remember those days?
I remember those days as if it was yesterday. As a matter of fact, you can single tick things yesterday and see log files produced, which indicates potential SQL injection, right? So
Possibly
there's a
blind.
conversation that something's never changed.
All right, very good. So thank you for that. Now, how did you get involved with Crest and what is Crest about?
Sure. So again, as the executive director for the Americas, North America and South
Hmm.
America, my focus there really is to help evangelize the organization a bit, focused around incident response, penetration testing, security operations centers, and many people know Crest that are either UK focused or even in Singapore with the Singapore
Singapore.
Regulatory Authority or
Ah,
MAS. Right.
yeah.
So my involvement with them, I was recruited by Ian Glover, who was the former global president. He had sat with me and he simply asked some basic questions. We had interacted over the years, but his question was, Tom, that you're coming to the end of your appointed term as a volunteer
Hmm.
with OWASP, and we Crest are looking for someone to assist us with our global expansion. So I said, okay, well, what do you guys do? Same question you're asking me, and he qualified it really simple. He said, hey, if you have an annual physical, do you go to a doctor? I said, yeah, of course I do. He goes, is that doctor accredited? I said, yeah, probably. He goes, what if you had, a problem with your heart? Would it be a specialist? I'm like, sure. He's like, brain problem specialist, right? So the idea of being able to be licensed and accredited started to sort of make sense. He then gave me another example and said, okay, well, legal problems. Do you go to a licensed practicing attorney? Sure. Uh, Next one was actually funny, which was, when you have your landscaper pull up in front of your house and he's pulling a lawnmower in the back, does he have a DEP sticker on the side in the United States that would give him the authority to spray chemicals to kill
Right.
weeds because it's required? And is it a registered business? And, does he have a license to drive? Again, certification and accreditation continue to sort of pop up. And I was like, well, yeah, you're right. He goes, what about cyber? And I was like, oh, no, that's ridiculous. We don't want to have that in the industry. He's like, but we do. He's like, because certain buyers are under regulatory control, and
Correct.
regulatory organizations want a better, secure, more secure supply chain. At the same time, many buyers don't know what they're really buying because, as you mentioned, this industry is still evolving. We've been doing it for almost 30 years now. But as you look at the buyer who says, oh, I want a pen test, they still sometimes get caught up in the
What is it,
conversation of what
right?
is that?
Yeah,
What is that?
exactly, exactly, absolutely. And I think, look, overall, there's an evolution curve, and we are an industry in the infancy. And you mentioned like the doctor profession that's been around for I don't know 2, 3, maybe 4,000 years in different forms and variants. So we're still evolving. Um, when it comes to Crest and your involvement, I completely understand that. Just a couple of basic questions for our listeners
Sure.
that haven't heard of Crest before. So is this a charity? Is this a profit, non-profit, a 501c3, C6? What is Crest and how is it regionalized around the world?
That's a great question. So, Crest is an international nonprofit based out of the UK. The
Hmm.
short history there was about 2006. It sort of was stood up with the assistance of GCHQ and organizations and agencies in that area to literally protect the crown jewels. So it became a club of organizations, of individuals that were running small businesses to be able to assist for information assurance. As
Right.
that continued to grow, it became sort of a group that was able to provide high levels of service and had trust, right? It had the idea that these were individuals providing services. And as it started to get bigger, Crest started to manage and influence certain programs.
Mhm.
So programs from NCSC, programs with Assure, programs that are happening now in
Seabest.
Australia, CBEST with the Bank of England. So Crest kind of came together as a organization that would kind of set the bar and say, is the business accredited? Meaning, is the business fit for purpose? Is it a legal entity? Does it have the appropriate controls in place to handle a customer's most precious data and information, such as vulnerabilities?
Mhm.
If they're handling incident response, what's their process? And then, of course, after the business passes muster based on reviews and controls like any other legitimate business, the next question becomes, what about the people?
Right.
And are the people fit for purpose? So Crest recognizes different training organizations all over the world as equivalencies. But at the end of the day, Crest also offers some certifications to demonstrate competency, again, for penetration testing, incident response, and security operations center. The concept there, of course, is that you can answer a bunch of questions and you might score 100%, fantastic. But if I put your hands on the keyboard, can you demonstrate it? So that's really
Can you
important to the
actually
Crest
hold
team.
your own, right? Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
competency. So
And
those things right there hooked me because I was really, I'm more of a hands-on sort of a guy, right? So I kind of like, okay, well, this accreditation certification thing, but let me understand more about what you're doing. I started to see the impact to some of the businesses and some
oh,
of
it's
the
real.
national critical infrastructure that,
Yeah.
wanted the right people to do the job, in addition to bug bounties, in addition to, one-off sort of assessments. But they wanted to have a repeatable methodology that was reasonable because every assessment, as we know, is a little bit different, right? And everything goes off the rails left and right. But the buyer wants to have a deliverable that's reasonably the same.
Yeah, absolutely. So and I really want this to hit home for our listeners who don't know Crest that well. So if you are, let's say, a straw man example, if you are in the UK and you're a financial services institution regulated, and there are certain, let's call them penetration. It's not a penetration test, but let's say penetration test with a bit of threat intelligence activity that you have to do and provide the report to the regulator, then you're looking for, as Tom has said, right, for a company that is Crest accredited and also the individuals having that level of rigor in terms of the background and professionalism. And I think that's one of the things that I've always respected about Crest, that depending on the clearance of information or networks or data that you deal with, the more stringent the checks are for basically the audience of people who are assuring your, let's say, network. Um, Now, okay, so thank you for that intro. That definitely clarifies Crest. Now, OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. Has been around since the early 2000s. It's a project that we can all contribute to. Can you just highlight for our listeners again who are not too familiar with OWASP and they browse to owasp.org and are lost in information, good information, plethora of information. Just a few projects and a few key highlights in terms of what can people expect in 2022 when it comes to the Open Web Application Security Project.
Sure, absolutely. So again, near and dear to my heart, still involved in OWASP, still involved in multiple projects, and still playing with software as a pastime. As we look at the organization still, remember that OWASP is about the individual. It's also a 501c3 not-for-profit based in the United States.
Yes.
It has about 35,000 participants around the world in over 200 countries these days. Probably well over 150 different projects at different stages. Everything from something that's brand new to something that's well flushed out, like projects we're going to talk about with ASVS, etc. But one thing that people can find is that if you're an open source developer and if you're beginning to understand, whether it be university or self-taught, and you're looking for security cheat sheets, then you can thank Jim Manico for all of his great work.
Yes,
If you're
great work
looking
from Jim
for
and the team. Yeah.
Right. If you're looking for materials around the OWASP testing guide, you can thank Owen and many people that have stepped in
Owen.
to help
Yeah,
make that
absolutely.
go.
Owen Kiri.
So,
Yep. Big shout out to
yeah.
those guys. Yep. Keeping it
So,
real on the AppSec front.
so a lot of the people that had set up things, and again, I can go project by project. There's lots of vulnerable applications for testing. There's
Simon
lots of
Bennett
cheat
with the SAP proxy. right?
Yeah,
Hands-on
the
tools.
Proxy is probably one of the better known platforms for doing web application testing. If you like Burp, try Zap. But at the end of the day, these are tools that are in the community that are open sourced, and of course that means something because people can put their passion into projects, whether it be as a side thing that they're educating, or but some people are putting a lot of life in there because what is open source? In many cases, many businesses build services business, right? Or they provide consulting around that. And that's perfectly okay. The open source model is the software is free, right? And the software can be, based on the GPL, based on the licensing, can
On
be
the
managed
license, yeah.
differently. But
Yeah,
the
so
idea is that
giving
many people
back.
provide a lot of great services around, tools that they're developing and things that they're building in open source.
Yeah. So if you're out there and you're thinking of getting involved in web application security, OWASP, a good starting point. If you are involved and are not contributing, well, frankly, why not? Right? I'd love to see more authors in the testing guide and people involved in reviews and information. I really enjoyed going through the OWASP Top 10 of 2021, and not so much the risks, but the process and rigor by which they were released. So have a look at that as well, and just get involved, be part of that global community, as Tom said. All right, so we talked a little bit about Crest. We talked a little bit about OWASP. This is exciting. I'm getting excited here, right? So somehow I sense, I wasn't there for it, but I sense a little Tom Brennan moment happening, just going, well, we've got all this great stuff happening in the open source web community for web application and mobile security, etc. And then we have businesses that want to standardize and sort of feed off the quality when they come to assurance exercises. How did that happen? What was the rationale? And can you take us through a brief timeline a little bit of when it happened as well?
Sure, sure. So as I mentioned, I've been with Crest now a little over 3 years,
3 years.
and as part-time working with them about 2 days a week, trying to help them with some initiatives. But what I noticed was first, I was approached by relationships and friends in the industry that happened to work for government agencies, that happened to work for large commercial organizations, that were involved in industry, that were building product, that were doing different things. And they were
Mm-hmm.
asking two questions, right? One, what is Crest? Because many of them in the Americas don't know what Crest is. There's no regulatory guidance or direction unless you're an international bank that Crest would even pop up. But as people started to ask, well, what are you doing over there? Why are you spending your time there? I explained to them the purpose of sort of driving, again, critical national infrastructure into a conversation that, when you're buying security services, incident response, penetration testing, security operations, there should be some minimum level. There should be some minimum bar. And I believe in that. I believe that the organizations, the buyers, should go and kind of know what they're getting and get a reasonable service, like fit for purpose. So that was really simple. And then because Crest has done
When was
so much
this?
great,
When did that happen?
again, 3 years ago when I
3
first
years
started
ago.
to get involved,
Right.
the conversation started. So then I was continued to be addressing with conversations such as CMMC. So the Department of Defense currently today, September, 2022, the Department of Defense is doing a massive lift of their security supply chain, trying to go ahead and have all of the defense industrial base that has a touch point with DoD, which is the largest buyer of everything in the Americas. They want to ensure that the supply chain has some checks and balances. And understand the context here. If you're attesting in contract language that you're meeting 800, 171, 853 compliance for the FAR,
Right.
that's great because you signed a document, but nobody's ever validated it. So again, we're going to go through this pretty quickly, but I kind of have helped with some of the activities that are associated. There have been some of the committees, that kind of a thing. And everyone's going, okay, that's great. That's DoD land. And that's going to happen through DoD. But what's happening in commercial side? And again, colleagues, friends that are involved in different industries start having the conversation about the thing that's really missing with all of these checks and balances is software security. Because I'll use Jeff Williams as a kind of a famous quote, I think, for me at least. We can build network security like blocks, but application security is like it's more like clay. Right, like it can kind of do
You
whatever it needs to
form
do.
it gets morphed to the specific requirements. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
especially when you start building an environment on a whiteboard and say, "Oh, here's what it's going to look like." Well, what's that going to look like at the end of the day with the application, manipulates the data, through the flow. So what I'm getting to is I looked at the conversation I'm being talked about, which was, hey, Tom, there's really nothing in the space that talks around application security that people can measure to. And then it started to happen. I started to have conversations with the United States agency like CISA, had
Right.
conversations in conversations through Crest, with the Singaporean Regulatory Authority, conversations with Germany, conversations with different governments and different programs that Crest is already involved in, because many of these agencies, Crest runs the regulatory program for them. As you mentioned, Bank of England before, all of these organizations say, hey, software security is super important to us. And you have this thing you're already doing for pen testing. That's fine. But application security, if we go a little bit deeper, starts to get a little bit blurry.
Can
Because
we
one
do it
thing you
for
can
a
do.
bigger spectrum than just penetration testing, right?
Correct. And if you start to lobby, and the way I understand it is if you start to set laws all over the world about privacy and security of citizens, things are going to change country by country.
Oh, yes.
And one of the great things, again, I used to work for Safecode as a technical director, and Howard Schmidt, God rest his soul, Howard always said this another interesting concept to me, which was, hey, if we can get innovation to agree on minimum standards, then organizations that want to adhere to a minimum standard, a commercially reasonable standard, if you will, then those organizations can certainly sort of help, rise the ships, or rise all ships, or make the bar, easier to accept, because legislation or legal laws are never going to be able to keep up with innovation. And we know that because
Correct.
we see how quickly it changes. So let's establish a bar. Let's establish what good looks like. Let's suggest that our stakeholders, governments, regulators, and commercial America, points to some standards and says, in order to ride the ride, you got to be at least this tall. And in order to be able to know what good looks like, these are the things that may have to be reviewed. And then
Right,
we can
right.
start applying this
And then
to
you
then to
have the ability to just take that evolution of, what started off as hacking and it was kind of like an art and craft and science, and now just go to the next level, which is that measure of a bar of what the minimum standard is, right?
I would think so. But remember, my opinion on that is there's always going to be the hacker attitude of, I don't need to follow a process methodology. I'm going to be, sort of a loose gun and go do my thing. And that's perfectly fantastic. But at the same time, there are reasonable controls that can be put in place during the beginning of a life cycle of an application. And I think one thing that many of the companies and organizations and agencies that we spoke with early on was they were already using ASVS. They were already using OWASP. They were already using the testing guide. They were already using different components. And
Tell
they're
us
like,
what
AS.
ASVS is, because you've just
Yep.
mentioned it, and it's the second time you're mentioning it. So, what does ASVS stand for, and what is it?
Yep. So OWASP has put together, again, people from all over the world to contribute to the application security verification standard. And this
ASVS.
has been around now for a number of years, and it's gotten continually better with peer review, hence the beautiful part of open source.
Yes.
And people like Josh Grossman, Ellard Lang, Daniel Colbert, again Jim Manico, and even Andrew Vanderstock, which happens to be the executive director of OWASP, and a whole list of other contributors, have sat down and over the years have been able to collaborate and put together a great guide for developers.
Right.
So if you're building software, ASVS is the place you should start with looking at the controls and looking at the requirements. If you're going to build a house, you're going to have plans. If you're going to build a house, you're going to have an engineer sign off on the plans that may be submitted to the township for approval.
Yes. Yep.
So if we look at it logically, if we're going to really build things that are going to be around for a purpose and are going to be able to meet defined requirements, if I can define some of those things up front, doesn't it make the job of the developer easier? So
Absolutely.
the concept is, let's give them the tools, the outline of what good looks like, and then you can apply it on different components. Now, it may not be applicable to all widgets, right? So I've done some stuff in the past with the FDA for medical devices, and some of the components may not be applicable because it may not apply to, let's say, a pacemaker or an insulin pump. However, if you're building a web application, if you're building something that may be on a mobile device, there's different components, of course, that may be there. So the Application Security Verification Standard,
ASVS.
we'll talk about it. ASVS is a fine document that all development teams should be well abreast to. Again, if you're building code.
Yeah.
In addition to that, there's I want to say a fork of the mobile application security standard, which is again similar, but now you can have a very focused conversation around mobile. So with ASVS, there's three levels, right? Level one is sort of the first steps. It's automated. It's a whole portfolio view. It provides sort of a checklist of things that people want to adhere to, and it may be very light touch, right? Because you have to still attest that these things are in place, and you want to be able to test for certain controls.
And it's the first level, right? It's where
Absolutely.
we start from. Yeah.
Yep. And then level two gets into what I would consider most applications that are, standard handling PII and handling, customer data and are there to protect a purpose, right? It's going to pull in, pull out, and manipulate. Again, every application is different, so you can't possibly cover all points. And then level three is kind of near and dear to my heart because, again, with critical national infrastructure, I'm always, as a foreign military guy, I'm always sort of focused about the warfighter on the battlefield, and especially in these days. But what level three is typically useful for is human life. So if you're building a control system,
something that's critical,
something that's critical to the business, right?
Yeah.
And again, that might be gazillions of dollars, or it might be, a million people that use it, or whatever it may be. But if you really think that your application that you're building has a lot of the requirements of, let's say, a regulated industry and/or human life involved, or significant, problems in the event of the application being compromised, level three would be the most appropriate.
Right.
So it's very simple.
Yeah. So if we look at the specifics of ASVS and how the levels are aligned, and it's kind of a maturity journey. So the more sensitive the information, the further the controls. And this is something that, of course, most organizations have in their information security policies. So Tom, you've talked a little bit about the key ingredients of OVS. So you've got the application security verification standard, its mobile version. You have open source communities behind each of that part of OWASP doing their thing. Then how does Crest come around and decide to build on that? And what are the ingredients that you guys have used at Crest for OVS?
Great question. So OWASP stands on its own 2 feet, right? And that's its own thing. The widget that we could have come together like peanut butter and jelly, if you like that analogy, is coming back to a conversation of the buyer. Again, government, regulatory, buyer. They're looking for the ability to say, who can I go get an assessment from that is a fit for purpose organizational verification of the company that's providing the service, and then the automation / people that are involved in delivering the service, that they're also fit for purpose and have the appropriate skill set. There's nothing worse in the world than buying something from an organization and getting what you believe to be a dysfunctional result. So again, trying to set standards is sort of helping a conversation where, as an open source project, we encourage that development should be using it ahead of time. Now, let's say you're buying a piece of software for whatever, level 1, level 2, level 3, whatever. When you're buying the application, what if you were to write into the contract with that provider that upon acceptance of an OVS assessment, meaning a third-party review, perhaps a code review, perhaps analysis, right?
Pen test, maybe?
Pen test, right? That would pass muster. And you'd be able to then say, okay, hey, the software can be delivered in such a way that can be reasonable. Unfortunately, I think we continue to see, and again, being in the industry a bit at the time, we see the industry as like $1 billion yard sale, right? Software, no guarantee, it's on you. We can't guarantee it's going to be secure. Depends how you implement it, how you configure it. Got it. But if you're making larger investments and you're buying product from development houses,
and it's critical as well, right?
Yeah, even if it's non-critical, shouldn't we be reasonable to say, hey, build my software to some standards that are there? And by the way, here's some open source standards, so they're not just something I'm throwing together that makes me a summary. Like, let's use something that people have vetted over the years and continue to get better and better. And then you can sort of have some expectations. Now, if you're in a regulated industry, which is, again, a lot of the participants or buyers in the ecosystem for the Crest environment, they're highly regulated. And some of these, again, are national critical infrastructure, and banking, of course, is part of that. So let's just talk about the concept of, I want to move money across the international lines, and I want to move money from the Americas over to the Bank of England. Well, you're going to touch things like CBEST, which was mentioned before. You're going to touch things that are going to be
Yes.
tied to assurance levels. And that's perfectly reasonable because both parties want to have some level of trust, but they're going to want to have a third party involved. So Crest today represents, 300 member companies, and it grows pretty much every month. But as it continues to get bigger and bigger, that represents a very small segment of the information assurance community that's there providing a service to help organizations be better. And it's names that are recognizable, and smaller firms that may have spun up with a few great guys that want to go ahead and start a consultancy. But remember, from the buyer perspective, this is a service as a nonprofit that's public facing. You can go to the crest-approved.org website, look at the full list of members,
And
look at
see
their
if they're
different
there.
accreditations,
Right.
and also see what regions they're authorized for. Because if you're authorized, let's say, to act to provide services in the UK, well, you may have not been reviewed to be able to deliver services in Australia, or be able to able to deliver services in state in the United States. So there's a conversation of regionalization. So a member organization can say, I'm a global company, I'm a regional company. That's the first conversation. And then the second piece is this is my team. And the team, of course, is verified and meets a code of conduct, and it can be acquired or can be purchased by a buyer and have some assurances. So there's some international banks that today have already made sort of Crest the de facto minimum standard. So their procurement department doesn't have to go through a supply
Requires.
chain review.
Right.
It's a
Exactly.
requirement.
You've got
So
the
now,
PSL list, almost short list, long list that you could use from the Crest approved website. So, question to you: every time
yeah,
that we've mixed, and I'm putting myself in this from previous engagements, every time that we mixed open source as cybersecurity professionals with commercial, even under the banner of nonprofit, because of course to get Crest approved you need, to pay an annual fee, etc., which is not that much, but still, right? You have that mixture of open source and a little bit of commercial under the nonprofit banner. Every time we've done that, we've received critique, and the critique, I imagine, in this case is, and I'm really interested in your answer and an answer to our listeners and viewers. So the question is, why do this under the commercial banner and not do it under the open source banner? Why release something, the Crest OVS, under the commercial banner and not do it through OWASP or other organizations with the purpose of making sure that, well, there's no revenue required. It just becomes a open registry, if you like. What's your response to that?
Yep. So again, let's rewind time a little bit, right? Being involved in OWASP for so many years on the board, there were a number of initiatives tied to OWASP certification and accreditation of individuals, as well as member companies. That really wasn't an area that the board at the time wanted to spend their efforts on, and the organization didn't really have an infrastructure to do that. If you look at like the Cloud Security Alliance or Center for Internet Security, and there's lots of great organizations out there that have sort of a similar model, or that they're working in different ways, and they decide to go down that path. OWASP decided not to. I was very conscious of that, and of course, looking at the concept of what we're being approached for on the Crest side, I
Mhm.
kind of scratched my head and came back to my OWASP colleagues and said, guys, there's an opportunity here. Again, peanut butter and jelly. If Crest can help the buyer, and OWASP can continue to stay true to its form about the individual open source community, and do what it does best.
Yep.
Is there a mechanism here that allows both of these things to play in the same sandbox? And then, in order to make that even more useful, again, having conscious knowledge and operational knowledge of both organizations, I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we propose that if OWASP can assist here and can accredit businesses have a deep understanding of software security, then all of those annual renewals, and again, for like $7,500 US, again, it's a regional accreditation. Let's take a percentage of that money and let's move that across the board as a donation to OWASP on an annual basis.
Right.
So this provides sort of a sustainable model that allows the community of buyers to be able to help fund open source assistance projects, research, sabbaticals, et cetera, et cetera. OWASP has done a number of phenomenal activities with different organizations around the world. And again, there are AppSec USA conferences, there are AppSec EU conferences, lots of great stuff. My point was, how do we take a project that has a number of individuals that are passionate about something. And in the OWASP world, when they needed something, they'd have to go, put their hand out and say, "Hey, can somebody help us with that?"
Please
So
donate, etc. Right? They didn't have
we
the channel revenues coming in. Yeah.
Correct. So I thought this would be an interesting way to sort of make that float. I proposed it to Anthony Vanderstock. He thought it was interesting as well. We went through that conversation. He brought it to the board of directors. We had a formal meeting. It's public, it's recorded, and we went through the particulars and the mechanics of it. Now, the number one thing I think everyone should know, again, knowing both organizations and being a fan of both, number one, anyone can do this. So if any organization out there decides that this is a good idea, they're more than welcome to step up to OWASP and do something similar. And I would hope that they're also going to give them some sustainable revenue to help make this process
Yes, it's
happen.
important that they give back, right? Not just take from the organization, but build that sustainable model that you said. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So it's definitely it was with respect and with collaboration. So Crest has nothing to do technically with the mechanics of ASVS. That's going to continue to be exactly as it has been for the years. And there's many individuals that participate with OWASP as individuals, not as companies, that may help influence the direction of those projects. But at the end of the day, they're kind of apples and oranges. And then on the Crest side, we were trying to, again, help the buyer find reasonable services in this particular
Quality of
space.
services. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's not the only thing that Crest does. That's, I think, something that might be new to some people. Since we run a lot of regulatory programs for governments around the world, as well as programs, we do red teaming, right? We have a red teaming accreditation. We do the pen test accreditation. Security operations is really important because all your
And it's becoming
organizations out
bigger
there.
and bigger, Tom. Yeah, SOC as a service. Yeah. So actually, just for our listeners, let me interject 1 second and ask you this question. You said that you run a number of regulatory programs for a number of government-related organizations. And just for our listeners and viewers, we're just past the half-hour mark, so we'll start taking questions. We have a few questions that have come in on Twitter. And I've got one by message. Feel free to use the chat that we have here. We'll go into Q&A in the last 15 minutes of this presentation. So back to you, Tom. Question there. When you say Crest runs a number of regulatory engagements for government-related organizations involved in regulation globally, anonymously, can you give us some examples of what it actually means to run such programs and what your involvement is versus the regulatory involvement?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is actually spelled out in writing on the Crest website as well. But I'll use one that I'm kind of very fond of right now, which is Assure, ASSURE. Now, Assure, as an example, back in I think 2020, Assure is really the schema that was developed in partnering with Crest that plays a role in sort of the cybersecurity oversight strategy for the aviation industry. Okay, aviation industry focused in the UK government's national security strategy. So by being able to have member companies that have the right for purpose, that have individuals and are there to meet that requirement, the regulatory body can say, "Thou shall have an annual assessment." And they should be or shall be on the accredited list, and then Crest helps manage that on their behalf.
Okay.
Now, what does that really mean? We're managing the review of the organization, the accreditation of the organization, we're making sure that they're fit for purpose. Our piece of that conversation is to provide sort of the ability for anyone that's in the Assure space, that's aviation, et cetera, that they can quickly find an organization that would meet their requirements. Now, of course, once they find the ones on the list, the next logical phase happens that they contact them, they would discuss and negotiate with them, and they would come to some sort of an agreement that would allow them to deliver a service. Now, because there's a sort of a relationship there, those member companies are also under a code of conduct, which basically allows Crest to also play a role. So if there's a problem with the buyer and the seller, Crest can step in and assist. Now, let me give you one of many examples. If the buyer is completely unsatisfied with the delivery of the thing that they were promised, well, there's an opportunity for them to raise a flag and say, "Hey, Crest, your member company promised this, delivered this. We feel there's a disconnect here, something wrong here, and we'd like to have Crest review this as a concept of was it within the boundaries of what was agreed upon as a Crest member company? And quite honestly, if it was gross negligence on behalf of the service provider, Crest can de-accredit them. We can delist them from our listing, and that would
Right.
potentially
Yes.
cause them financial harm, right? Like that's a real thing. At the same time, if individuals within that service provider decide that it's a great idea to go out on Twitter and ODay different organizations and drop bombs on bypasses, etc., well, you probably would agree they probably have violated an internal process or an NDA within their organization. The individuals probably are a little bit less than ethical at that point, and
Less than
now that
ethical. Yeah.
organization, right, that organization has sort of a responsibility to do the right thing. So we might step in and say, hey, guys, this is a blatant problem, and again, Crest could help that organization as well as the buyer to ensure that there's some reasonable solution here. So we get involved in the commercially reasonable discussion, and being part of a member association, you join
Gives
because
that
you're trying to
ethics transparency, right?
you're trying to level up,
Mm.
and that's where I think some people get confused. It's not so much it's not so much that Crest is a delivery vehicle, because we're not, right? We're not delivering any of these services. It's not a company that does that, but we are accrediting and managing and watching over the membership to ensure that there's meeting some requirements. That's in addition, by the way, to a lot of the philanthropy work that we do and research work, the Melinda Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation work we've just completed. There's a lot of different things that we've actually worked on that are just great for the community. Diversity projects, all sorts of great stuff that Crest continues to be involved in.
So you mentioned ethics, and you have, of course, ethics at an individual level. So, for example, in order for us to hold some of the accreditation certification certificates and be part of schemes, we as cybersecurity professionals are used to complying with codes of ethics. Now, there's a big thing around the ethics behind business engagements involving cybersecurity services, especially in and around when you have companies that are saying that they can do everything, right? And it turns out that it's a man in a shop. And they don't have EDR capabilities, they don't have ELM capabilities, they don't have DLP, but they have promised that to the buyer. Now, question to you, have you in your time at Crest seen any cases of either discipline, unethical behavior, or that business to business transaction just being below par? And if so, is that a common thing, or are we seeing less of it these days?
So I think I think Crest sees less of it, because what we see is we see organizations that are being fit for purpose. That's the space they want to be in. That in many cases their customers are now demanding it as a buyer, and they go, "What's this Crest thing?" And they go, "Oh, okay. So what are you guys going to do? We're going to make sure that your business is, a legitimate company. We're going to make sure that you don't have any foreign influence. We're going to make sure that the organization is structured in a way that's legal and professional. We're going
Mm-hmm.
to make sure you have the right policies and programs and a typical assessment. So if you've gone through a ISO 27001, or you've gone through any sort of review, think of it like almost SAS 70 like, where that we're looking at an organization's function and purpose. And then, as mentioned before, then we start looking for the people that are in the organization as to who are these individuals. Do they have assessments background? Do they have background checks? Is there components there that allows the buyer to feel confident to work with the organization? And again, we all know brand names and perhaps not brand names, but the reality is it sort of levels the playing field, because if you're able to meet and adhere to the Crest accreditation level, well then congratulations, right? You've sort of leveled up, and now you can demonstrate that to the buyer, which makes it quite easy for the organizations to move quickly. So
Right.
we go back to the thing. There's a there's a thing like the Security Operations Center, which you mentioned before, that nowadays, as an example, organizations can be a small MSP, and they can be handling data 24/7, and they might call themselves an MSSP. The idea is they may actually be classified as a Security Operations Center, because again, they're handling data and they're responding to it, and they're professing that they're doing that. But let's now measure that. Let's really look under the covers. Let's really talk to the organization and see if it passes
See what
muster
it what is
as it
actually
pertains to
doing.
that.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and when it does, we're happy to stamp it and say, yeah, we did a good review in this organization. They're good for purpose. Now, by the way, if they're not, it's not a bad thing. Organization applies. Here's what we do. We like to do pen testing. Here's how we do it. We like to pull out our favorite tool and press a button. And Crest goes, well, thank you. All your paperwork is in order. This is all good. But your approach and your methodology, unfortunately, doesn't really meet the level of a Crest accredited company, because our organizations have a lot of professional services skill and can demonstrate competency more than pushing a button.
Right. It's
So
not
the
just
point of
about
it
running
is
the tool, right? There has to be
correct.
more behind the engagement. Yeah, absolutely.
Correct. Methodology, approach, delivery, confidentiality of the data, how it's handled within the organization. There's a bunch of pieces of the puzzle that go together.
And those
So
important
again,
pieces, yeah.
absolutely. And I think that, again, whether you're just starting out as a small boutique or you're a large multinational service provider, it's a good opportunity to sort of look and see, well, what is the minimum bar?
Benchmark yourself. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then I think that does go back to the other side, because I mentioned I'm with Crest part-time. My other job is I'm the CIO of a nationwide law firm called Mandelbaum Barrett here in the States. And being with this organization for a number of years now, I really have a better appreciation for some of the legal T's and C's. Why? Because I've seen it in litigation. I've seen it
When
in
it
court,
goes
right?
wrong, right? Yes,
I've seen it
absolutely.
go wrong. And one of the simple questions is, to the person that's in the box is, what framework did you use to build this product? What third party organization did you use to help give you information assurance? What commercially reasonable standard did you meet? And that really is when it gets tricky, because very quickly we can see organizations that say, well, I don't know, Dave did it. Right. And that's it. Like, there's not much going
The
on there.
overpromise of the service, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very important as we evolve as an industry and as cybersecurity grows that we follow and adhere to a minimum set of standards. It might be ASVS, it might be things that you guys do at Crest, it might be other organizations, but there is a set of standards, regardless of framework. There is a framework being applied that shows that relevant rigor has been put in place for the security controls. Why? Because we're going to find that bit of infrastructure in an application that's part of critical infrastructure in the future. We're going to find it as a library dependency in, I don't know, a pacemaker, or we're going to find it in a web application that has single factor authentication and all of a sudden has grown outside of its original use cases. So Tom, for you, in terms of somebody wanting to engage with this marriage of Crest with OWASP when it comes to the Crest OVS, what is the opening step? Is it a step of company? Is it a step of an individual approaching Crest and saying, how can I benchmark myself? And how do you go about, if you haven't done this before, how do you go about starting that process?
Great question. Super simple. So again, I suggest that if your client is looking for this level of assurance, maybe because their procurement officer wants it, or maybe because their CTO is looking to be progressive and wants to have a minimum standard. But at the end of the day, you contact Crest. You look at the different region that you're in. There's a direct, link on the page for the different regions, and you basically reach out and say, "Hi, I'm ABC Company, and we're interested in OVS." Why? Because again, you're going to demonstrate your competency in application and software security. Once you are recognized as an entity, we are then going to provide, again, a mutual NDA. At that point, an organization is going to be assigned an assessor.
Okay.
The assessor is going to do a kickoff call with the client and have a conversation with them about, again, our accreditation process and timelines and how that works. If that's acceptable to the organization, then the next thing they're going to do is they're going to receive a questionnaire, which every assessment starts over the questionnaire. And we're going to gather some basic facts. We're going to gather things around the entity. We're going to gather things around the legalities. We're going to gather some policies, some processes, et cetera. And then, of course, it's going to be digested. Now, after it's digested, then the assessing team is going to work with the member company or work with the prospective member company to identify that all things sort of pass muster. Along the way, any snags that are hit or any things that are missing, an organization is informed that these areas are deficient, and they can go back and correct them. The point of it is that we're here to help sort of have a reasonable outline for what good looks like. So it's not a pass-fail discussion. It's like, hey, you pull into the automobile shop and you say, do you have all four tires? Are they at the same air pressure? Are your brakes good? Do you have
There's a
glass?
number of checks that you go through, basically, right?
Yeah,
And what
so you go
about
through the checks.
individuals? That's okay for the company. What about individuals? Does that come afterwards? Can that happen in parallel?
It can happen in parallel. So let's say, as an example, that your team has done a considerable amount of application security testing. They may have been all self-taught. They may be able to demonstrate that they're involved in many projects or tools or things that they've written, and that's fantastic, right? That helps quantify their ability for this particular component. Now, with with OVS, what we're trying to accomplish is that the organizations have a deep understanding of application security. That's really
Right.
the measurement. So as the organizations then level their teams and say, okay, well, we have these guys that do threat modeling, we have these guys that do pen test work. They may say, oh, I may have an OSCP that, excuse me, that I went through and I have that accreditation. And we recognize accreditations from many different membership organizations that are similar to that, right? Because there's training all over the world. And then, of course, Crest also has its own training and I'm sorry, its own certification. And in this case, the pen test accreditation would be the most appropriate. The pen test certification would be the most
For the pen
appropriate. But
tester to pass
for the pen
the
test,
exam, right?
correct. But again, that may leave an opportunity for somebody to say, wait a second, we're trying to do our client.
Services, right?
Yeah, our client would like to have us do threat modeling. Your pen test certification doesn't do anything about threat modeling. Okay, well that's fine. But the idea is we look at the individuals that are doing the actual work, and we're looking at what are their years of experience, what is their focus. Is it 1 year, is it 5 years, is it 10 years? Kind of having some understanding as to what their hands-on abilities are. If they are working with other organizations, ISC squared, SANS, CSA, all these things mean something because we're looking for a registrar of the service provider. The same way that people could say reasonable that if you had an entity that's providing services to millions of customers, wouldn't you look at your company and your people and say, are my people are appropriate skill level? Are they there helping
Yeah,
the business?
absolutely.
It's the same on the service
I
provider
would
side.
definitely look at my people, right? And also look at if they don't have it now, do we need to put it in the roadmap for their development, for them to grow as individuals? So boys and girls don't stay stagnant in their career, but also explore other opportunities. So we're just past the 45 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun. What can I say? Shall we open it up to questions?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is an area that I personally enjoy, and it's been sort of the fight that I've been fighting for a long, long time, which is making things better. And quite honestly, I think it's the more people that are involved in that, the more welcoming it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, others can do this as well, right? So if there's part of the OWASP project suite that people want to take a similar path, Tom has explained what that path is, which is put a proposal together, take it back to the board, let them discuss it, and let that decision-making process just come out of good synergies, good collaborations. I think that's how we move forward as an industry. All right, question number one. Slightly antagonistic, but one of our viewers has asked, what is the amount of pennies Crest plans to give back to OWASP, and how can we keep you accountable of actually doing that?
That's a great question. So the answer is 15%. The answer is 15% was negotiated with the OWASP board of directors, and it's in
15% of
writing.
what, please?
15% of the assessment. So let's say it's
Ah,
$7,500 of the organization to join Crest as it pertains to being a member company, right?
mhm.
OVS is an endorsement. OVS is a deep knowledge in the application security space. That's $2,500. Again, I'm using U.S. numbers here. So out of the $2,500, 15% of the OVS, which is what we're speaking about, is allocated to to OWASP to be paid quarterly. That is also in addition to Crest's annual supporter membership of OWASP. So again, I sort of built a sustainable model that allows the individuals involved in this program to realize that if OWASP doesn't want to do it themselves, no problem. if Crest is going to do it, we're going to do it in a way that's sustainable, that's able to actually help the bottom line for the organization. So again, it's 15% of $2,500 US, and that's the answer.
Okay, thank you. Next question: which parts of OWASP projects, or which OWASP projects should be, which OWASP project, I think this question should say, are included in OVS?
Well, the only one that is explicitly called out is ASVS and MASVS.
The mobile version, right?
Correct. And obviously, being an OWASP guy too, these have dependencies, right? They have dependencies that are tied to things like the OWASP testing guide. They have things like the OWASP top 10. They have dependencies like now Cyclone DX. Like there's different components, but to answer your question directly, OVS is all about ASVS and MASVS. So in January, or let's call it the first quarter of next year, when we're currently on version 4 of ASVS, when
there's a new draft being planned, right?
Correct. So when that team finalizes and ratifies version 5 and that drops, then of course Crest will have to acknowledge that and then update its program to be stamped for version 5. Right now we're version 4, obviously. And again, if anyone wants to be involved in influencing ASVS, I highly encourage them to go to OWASP.org, look up the ASVS project, and participate. Do some code commits, do some reviews, and share some knowledge. The better we can make the standard, the better it is for the privacy and security of everybody.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's how I got started with the Open Web Application Security Project. And little did I know when I volunteered for, I don't know, writing a section in the testing guide that I would get the whole spreadsheet of edits. But it's a good journey. It's, for especially junior staff coming up through the ranks and wanting to, feel empowered and participate in industry. Yes, blogging is important, but go and contribute. And it's not just OWASP, there's a number of open source projects that you could be involved with. And simple tasks like doing reviews will get you very far in terms of earning your right to commit and be listened to in future versions. So really key. Okay, next question. When it comes to Crest, what is the difference in cost between certifying an individual and an organization?
Sure. So we sort of covered the accreditation numbers regionally: $7,500 US, $2,500 for the OVS endorsement. That's that. If you go global, you multiply that by the regions that your business operates in. Very simple. Individuals, they have the ability to go ahead and test as it pertains to reaching a Crest accreditation, actually a Crest certification.
Right. Pen testing as one example, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's, depending on GDP in the region, it's a few $100s. But the idea is you're basically sitting and not writing, but you're sitting and taking a competency exam. And again, if you were to invest that monies in another organization's training and accreditation and competency, that's mapped. And we recognize other organizations. Again, Crest's primary focus these days is to help organizations understand that the accreditation component is really important to the buyer, which is again translates to being really important to the regulator, which means really important to traceability and being able to demonstrate commercially reasonable security.
Yeah,
it's not it's not 20 years ago.
And I think it's very important that both individual and organization continue to aspire to be better in a transparent way. I definitely have a number of qualifications that I let expire because I'm not actively doing, penetration testing as a professional day in, day out. My life is slightly more complex with, modern CISO related services. And I think overall, it's good to show that career progression in that somebody was once an accredited pen tester. It's a bit like being a professional poker player, right? You've managed to do that, and you know what it means to be able to hold your own at that super professional level.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I always get caught in that conversation of, Tom was a Marine, right? It's like once a Marine, always a Marine, right? But at the end of the day, the fight still continues. When you take an oath, if you will, it never ends. But the idea here is I'm very focused on trying to improve software security. I've been doing that for a long time. So this to me seems very natural. And of course, everything can always be better. And that's where we, look to the community to look at what we're doing, to vet it, and either get behind it or don't. But if you don't, I'd love to hear what alternatives are there to help the buyer have some assurances so mom and dad can have some security and privacy in their world.
Yeah, indeed. Last question is from me, and it's more of a thesis than a question. So I'm seeing it. I'll turn it into a question. I'm seeing a lot of SOC maturity related assessments, a lot of MSSPs providing SOC as a service to levels and standards that you read in contracts and are just not possible, right? We will catch all malware on your network. It's like, okay, that's a lot of work, right? I don't know what IOCs you're using or what hunting you're doing. So with that thesis, my question to you is, what do you think is the current maturity of the SOC-related service providers out there compared to the more traditional red teaming, hunt teaming, threat intelligence, pen testing services?
So each of the different categories has its own challenges. Certainly, if we look at SOC, as was mentioned, I was just at another association's event yesterday, and they're all focused on SOC organizations that are MSSPs. And asking that question in a room of about 150 organizations, answer is very different. A little scary, actually, because again, there's
Why is that?
standard.
There's no
Well, because
standard.
I think that organizations haven't agreed on terminology in some cases. I think that marketing, will always promise that it's the solution to the world's problems, but unfortunately, the reality is that technical resources understand that there's nuances and there's different technologies and different approaches. And since security has so many different angles of attack, if we were looking at a SOC and we're looking at network-based applications that are going to be identifying problems and weaknesses, we want to make sure that we have some reasonable assurances as the buyer that this tool does what it's supposed to do. So is Crest accrediting products? We are not. Is Crest accrediting businesses that have the right people, process, and technologies in places? We're there to help make sure that we can facilitate that and present that to an educated buyer. That's really the way it works. If you look at like the Consumer Reports model, which is also a nonprofit, by the way, it's important to give people the facts and the details and
Yes.
allow that risk profile to be assessed and can be categorized. As an example, the Crest organization ran the CIRA program for the National Security Agency, which was the incident response effort.
Crest runs Sierra. Right. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yep. So the same thing holds true that we can shortlist organizations that have the right capabilities and abilities to deliver. But of course, that agency or other agencies would then do their own review deeper. Like what you have to pass muster, right? Like once you're able to ride the ride and you're this tall, okay, great. That goes to the next level. In some cases, it really helps procurement and really helps the organization have a warm and fuzzy. Think about this. How many organizations right now are running vendor risk management programs?
Yes, the
Do you
third
want
party. Yeah.
do you want your vendor risk management problem to be with your cybersecurity provider? I probably think that that's one area that should be a little tight opposed to others that may have access to
No,
your
I
business.
completely agree with you. And I think we need an MSP maturity framework for cybersecurity services. Because if you think about the traditional model of an MSP picking up a set of tools, sending their folk on training, billable resources, and then churning out revenue on something that is a cyber related service, that model is good up to a point. And then you need to put processes behind it, policies perhaps. You need to continue educating your staff. And frankly, I think MSPs are not there yet, and we've got to help them get there, to your
Well,
point.
I mean, that's again, that goes back to the mission with Crest, right? The Crest mission is very simple. We're here to help build trust in the digital world by raising professional standards and delivering some measurable quality assurance. That's it. And how do we do that? We work with organizations that are fit for purpose and work with individuals that are, focused in this particular area. We have, as mentioned, a couple different areas of interest. So if your listeners are involved in pen testing, Take a look at the pen test accreditation. Look at OVS. They're two different things, but they're very much important for software security. If you're doing incident response and you're there for your customer's worst day, well, let's help those customers identify how to find you before they need you and be proactive in that conversation.
And
And
actually
certainly,
have a proactive dialogue. Yeah, absolutely.
and if you're a SOC organization and that's going to be a focus that you're going to want to come to market to, how do you set yourself apart? Perhaps you can help you have your organization understand that you are, one of few that deliver types of services that have been reviewed. And quite honestly, as Crest continues to grow its membership of niche consultancies and organizations that do this as a service, I would rather compete on merit and compete on relationships and compete on value with my peers, because many of us, we all know each other, right? It's a small industry, believe it or not, right? We all go to DEF CON Black Hat or go out to 44 Con, or there's a circle within a circle. So it's okay to compete against your peers, but I also want my peers to understand that my level of service is here, and it's nice to be able to compete with those that are at a similar level.
Absolutely. And with that, I think, Tom, time is to thank you here for explaining what Crest has done with OVS, how you're building on the great work that OWASP is doing, and just taking us through a deep insight of basically that marriage between a 501 profit that is looking at standardizing and bringing digital companies together at a level of assurance that's appropriate. And at the same time, I really enjoyed the conversation that we had about giving back to the open web application security project folk. Those people like yourself work really hard as volunteers, so it's very important that they get their rewards out of it.
Well, I'd like to thank you for the invite, and I can say for any of our industry listeners, there's really nothing better than giving your employees some time to contribute. And of course, if they can contribute to Habitat for Humanity, perhaps they can contribute in the software space as well. So the concept is give back to your community, and I think that we can all take some time and learn from each other because the industry is quite complex and it needs people involved that actually are passionate about it.
Definitely. And I'd like to thank our audience for today. This will be, of course, on YouTube on Cyber Risk Engineering. Thank you all